Hey everyone, Michael D'Angelo here. It's been a while, I hope everyone's doing well, and welcome back to the channel. So about 2 years ago, I posted a video all about microphones. And in that video, we looked at different kinds of microphones, different brands, different price points, really to compare them and hear if there were any significant differences between them. And if you want to check out that original video, I have it linked up here and in the description below. Now, the conclusion that I came to, which was that there wasn't really a whole lot of difference between these microphones. Now, there were some subtle differences, but I was really surprised to hear, say, a $150 Audio-Technica microphone hold its own against microphones 4 or 5 times the price. It really goes to show how far we've come when it comes to recording technology and accessibility. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get a good recording. But the microphone only tells one part of the story. There are a number of significant factors that go into the overall sound of your recording, namely the drums, the instrument, how it's tuned, the room that you're recording in, and of course, the player. I think the player will have the most impact on your recorded sound. So there was a lot of really nice feedback on that video, a lot of great comments. I really appreciate those. And one topic that came up a lot was the importance of placement and how that affects the sound. So I thought a logical follow-up to that original video would be to look at different microphone placements and setups to hear how it captures the drum set, so that if you're getting started with recording and you're looking for some ideas, hopefully you'll find a setup here that works for you. So this is probably going to be like a mini series of videos. So if you want to follow along as I post new episodes, make sure to click the subscribe button. And if you like this kind of stuff and you want to see more of it, click the like button. Apparently that helps. So let's get started with some mono overhead setups. And you may be wondering, why mono? Why only use one microphone? And there are a few reasons for this, some practical and some musical. One practical reason is that when many people are starting out, they want a low barrier of entry, and it's really simple to get started with a 2-channel interface and a single mono overhead microphone and a bass drum microphone. That's how I started, and I got lots of great recordings over the years, and you can certainly start adding to it later by upgrading your interface and adding more microphones. Now, another practical reason is that a single microphone or two captures your true sound on the instrument, and it can give you a good representation of your balance and your sound production, which is really helpful if you record your practice sessions to listen back to afterwards. It's also a lot easier to mix with less microphones. Imagine having 8 spot microphones and having to get a nice balanced sound when you don't have a lot of experience with recording. With 2 microphones, it's really easy to just get started and go. Now, a musical reason is that a lot of earlier recordings made in the 50s and 60s were recorded in mono and only used 1 or 2 microphones on the drum set. I've seen many photos from these recording sessions of, say, Philly Joe Jones, Art Blakey, Elvin Jones, and even Ringo Starr with just a single microphone over the drum set and a bass drum mic. So when we're talking about jazz drum set recordings and getting that kind of old school vintage sound, then it's probably a good idea to mic the drums in a similar way. So with that said, our first setup is what we're going to call the vintage setup. I'm calling this setup the vintage setup because it's based on the photos that I just showed you. Now, there are some rumors out there that Rudy Van Gelder, who was the house engineer at Blue Note Records, moved microphones around when cameras were present so he wouldn't give away his techniques. But I've seen this placement used by many engineers in a lot of different situations, so I think there is some validity to it. This placement involves putting the microphone in front of the drum set, overlooking the cymbals and rack tom, and angled down toward the gap between the snare drum and floor tom. This placement is a lot closer than most overhead setups, so you'll get less of the room sound in the recording, which was helpful since a lot of those old recording sessions were done in one room with minimal isolation. The resulting sound is a nice overview of the kit with a lot of forward presence. Now, some cons is there may be a little bit too much rack tom in the sound, but that can be tamed with a bit of compression. Before we get to the playing examples, all the recordings you're going to hear have no post-processing, no compression, no EQ, and you're just hearing the overhead mic. I did record a bass drum mic along with the overheads, and we'll do some back-to-back comparisons at the end where I'll include the bass drum mic. We're going to be using today the Neumann TLM 102 large diaphragm condenser mic. It's a great mid-budget microphone at a fixed cardioid pattern, and it isn't too colored. So let's hear what the vintage setup sounds like. Our next setup is a true overhead setup, and it's about the same distance to the drum set with the vintage setup, but directly over the kit pointing down at the bass drum. So I'm going to call this the close overhead setup. This setup will have a little bit more point to the sound, especially with the bass drum beater, because the diaphragm of the mic is pointing straight at it. Now, blended with a bass drum mic, you're going to get a nice round attack from the bass drum and good definition from the sticks on the drums and cymbals. Our third setup is what I call the far overhead setup, and it's exactly the same as the last setup, but I raised the microphone stand as high as it can go. Now, increasing the distance of the microphone to the source will give you a little bit more space and room sound, and is a great option if you have a good sounding room. It will, however, very slightly reduce the attack and presence of the sticks on the drums and cymbals, but I think it's a good compromise. So let's hear the far overhead setup. The last setup is one I got from my former teacher, Rick Dior, who is a great drummer, educator, and audio engineer. He suggested for a single overhead setup to place the microphone behind the drums, directly over the drummer's head, pointing down at the kit from an angle. Now, this setup is similar to the first vintage setup, but because it's addressing the kit from the drummer's perspective and pointing down at the bass drum, you'll get a lot more of that in this setup. And it's kind of more true to life and a good representation of what the drummer is hearing sitting behind the drums. So let's hear the above head rear setup. Okay, so now that we've heard each of the 4 setups, let's listen to them back to back. We're going to add our bass drum microphone, which is a Shure Beta 52A, one of the more popular bass drum microphones out there, and hopefully you'll be able to hear the subtle differences between each microphone placement. So, which one was your favorite? I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments below. Some of my favorite recordings I've done for projects have been these single overhead setups because it's really easy to get a great sound with a minimal amount of equipment. So I suggest you give it a try. In part 2, we're going to look at stereo or 2 microphone overhead setups and how we can add some depth to our recording with stereo imaging. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.